Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
Good morning, I'm Nathan Hager.
And I'm Karen Moscow. Here are the stories we're following today.
Karen, stocks are coming off their worst week since March of last year. After another disappointing jobs report revived concerns the economy is cooling and the Fed is moving too slowly to rescue it. But speaking with Bloomberg's David Gura over the weekend at the Texas Tribune Festival, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen said she is not yet worried.
Overall, I would say for the U.S., the kinds of metrics that we would monitor that would summarize risks, whether it's asset valuations or the degree of leverage, things look good. I don't see red lights flashing.
Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen speaking with Bloomberg's David Gura. She reiterated her view that the U.S. economy has reached a soft landing even as job growth weakens.
Well, Nathan, traders will now be keeping a close eye on the next key economic data point. On Wednesday, we get the Consumer Price Index report for the month of August, and we get more from Bloomberg Markets Live strategist Mary Nicola.
It was almost up until the labor market report that the CPI was dismissed, that labor market was going to give us an inclination of what the Fed was going to do. And of course, now that that's not the case, really the onus goes back on CPI. If you get a weaker number, then obviously it could precipitate expectations of a jumbo rate cut of 50 basis points because of the fact that it tells you that the Fed should no longer be concerned about inflation. However, you get an upside surprise and then it makes the Fed a little bit more cautious because of the fact that the inflation genie is not fully back in the bottle.
Bloomberg Markets Live strategist Mary Nicola says a day after we get the CPI, investors will get another inflation reading on Thursday with producer prices for the month of August.
Well, in Asia, Karen, deflation risk is rising in China. We get more on that from Bloomberg Daybreak Asia anchor Brian Curtis in Hong Kong.
China's consumer prices rose less than expected last month. It's more data showing that households are simply not spending. The CPI gained 0.6% from a year earlier compared to a forecast of 0.7%. In the meantime, factory gate prices slid 1.8% from a year ago. Economists had expected a drop of 1.5%. Former central bank governor Yi Gang has called on policymakers to fight deflationary pressures and do it right now. In Hong Kong, Brian Curtis, Bloomberg Radio.
All right, Brian, thank you. Now let's get the latest in the presidential race. Kamala Harris and Donald Trump are getting ready for their first and for now only debate tomorrow night in Philadelphia. And the race is airtight with 57 days until the election. The latest New York Times Siena College poll has Trump in the lead over Harris among registered voters by just 1 percentage point, 48% to 47%. Nikki Haley was the last Republican to challenge Trump in the primary. She says Harris is vulnerable tomorrow night.
You look at Kamala Harris, and it's quite remarkable. She never had a debate. She never had a primary. She never had anyone vote for her. And they basically took her, and in 48 hours, they put her back out there, and she was this whole new candidate.
And following the debate, Harris plans to travel to key battleground states, including North Carolina on Thursday. That state's Democratic Governor Roy Cooper says he knows the race is tight.
There's no question about it. It's close here in North Carolina. It always is. This was Biden-Harris's closest loss in 2020, only 1.3%.
Roy Cooper and Nikki Haley were both guests on CBS's Face the Nation, which can be heard Sundays on Bloomberg Radio. Our coverage of the ABC News presidential debate begins tomorrow night at 8 p.m. Wall Street time on a special edition of Balance of Power on Bloomberg Radio and television.
In company news, Karen, it is a big day for Apple. The company unveils its iPhone 16 today. While the new iPhone line will be the focus of the product launch, its slumping wearable device business is poised to get a boost as well. For the first time since the end of 2022, Apple is unveiling major changes to the Apple Watch and AirPod earbuds. All three versions of the smartwatch, the SE, the standard series line, and the Ultra will be upgraded, and the two lower-end AirPods will get the most significant update in their history.
Well, Nathan, shares of Boeing up 3.4% this morning. The plane maker and its largest unions say they've hammered out a landmark deal to potentially avoid a strike. We get more from Bloomberg's Doug Krisner.
The breakthrough came after a marathon bargaining session. The current contract expires at midnight September 12th, and a possible strike is looming. The deal includes a 25% wage increase over 4 years, as well as a commitment to build Boeing's next plane in the Seattle area. There are sweeteners if workers accept the accord, an immediate 11% pay bump, along with a $3,000 bonus to be paid at the end of the month. Boeing CEO Kelly Ortberg has pledged to reset long contentious labor relations. But it's too soon to know if workers will go along or buck their leadership. In New York, I'm Doug Krisner, Bloomberg Radio.
Thanks, Doug. Circle K is trying to keep its takeover bid for 7-Eleven alive. The Canadian owner of Circle K, Couche-Tard, has told Japan's 7 & I Holdings it wants to work together on a friendly takeover after the Japanese convenience store operator pushed back on Couche-Tard's initial proposal. 7 & I is the operator of 7-Eleven shops. It rejected Couche-Tard's price as too low and fraught with regulatory risk and made clear that price was the issue, not the idea of an acquisition itself. A potential deal would create a global convenience store behemoth with more than 100,000 stores. It would represent the biggest ever foreign takeover of a Japanese company.
And Nathan, discount retailer Big Lots is filed for bankruptcy. Big Lots is among a number of troubled retailers that have been hurt by a slowdown in home spending. Collins and LL Flooring Holdings also filed bankruptcies in recent months. Time now for a look at some of the other stories making news in New York and around the world. For that, we're joined by Bloomberg's John Tucker. John, good morning.
And good morning, Karen. The White House today is taking steps to lower mental health care costs. We'll get more in this report from Bloomberg's Jeff Bellinger.
New guidelines seek to ensure that Americans have the same access to mental health and substance use benefits that they have to physical health benefits. The proposal seeks to build on the 2008 Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act, which required insurance companies to provide the same access to mental and physical treatment. When the bill passed, it did not require some non-federal government health plans, like those offered to state and local government employees, to comply with its requirements. Jeff Bellinger, Bloomberg Radio.
Republican lawmakers accuse the Biden administration of lying to Americans and sacrificing the safety of U.S. soldiers during the 2021 Afghanistan withdrawal. The accusation comes in a report that seeks to implicate Vice President Kamala Harris before the election. It says President Joe Biden's team misled and in some instances directly lied to the American people at every stage of the Afghanistan withdrawal. A gunman killed 3 Israelis at a terminal on Jordan's border with the Israeli-occupied West Bank on Sunday. It's the first such incident since the Gaza war began in October. Israel's army said the gunman accused accessed the Allenby Bridge crossing, also known as the King Hussein Bridge, from the Jordanian side, and fired shots before he was killed by Israeli guards. Jury selection set to begin today in the federal trial of 3 former Memphis police officers charged with violating the civil rights of Tyree Nichols. He's the 29-year-old man whose fatal beating last year was caught on police cameras, while also triggering protests and calls for police reform. A storm system in the Gulf of Mexico forecast to strengthen into a hurricane early this week, bringing heavy rain, damaging winds, and potentially life-threatening storm surges to parts of the Texas and Louisiana coastlines. If it continues to strengthen, it'll be named Tropical Storm Francine. And a good Samaritan with a familiar name helped save a choking man at the Hampton Beach lobster roll eating competition in New Hampshire Sunday. Governor Chris Sununu was at the event. He says he was the first to notice a contestant having trouble breathing. The governor performed the Heimlich maneuver before first responders took over and helped free the stuck piece of lobster.
He went right back to the contest, which I couldn't believe. He ate another 7 lobster rolls after that, right down the gullet.
Governor Sununu speaking there to WMUR. Global news, 24 hours a day, whenever you want it, with Bloomberg News Now. I'm John Tucker, and this is Bloomberg. Nathan and Karen.
Another 7 lobster rolls. Wow, John, thank you. Time now for the Bloomberg Sports Update with John Stashower. John, good morning.
Good morning, Karen. It was the Giants' 100th season opener and one of their worst. They let the Vikings score in the first quarter. They gave them a 99-yard drive in the second. Minnesota scored again early in the third, when later the Giants had the ball deep in their own territory.
Vikes lead 21-6. Jones. Oh, he threw it to Van Ginkel. Touchdown! That's the 4th touchdown is like a book, and that book had a happy ending. 27-6, Minnesota.
On K-Fan, 28-6 the final. Many of the fans headed for the exit early, and the ones that stuck around spent much of their time booing the Giants' effort, especially inept offensively. Under 100 yards in the first half, Daniel Jones severely outplayed by the Vikings. Sam Darnold, the ex-Jet, who completed his first 12 passes, 2 for touchdown. Jones in his last 2 seasons has only 2 TD passes, 8 interceptions, and only 1 victory. The Patriots in a surprise one for new coach Gerard Mayo, 16-10 at Cincinnati. The Commanders lost at Tampa Bay, 37-20. Dallas won 33-17 at Cleveland after Dak Prescott got a new $60 million a year contract. Miami on a last-second field goal beat Jacksonville. Tyreek Hill had an 80-yard catch after getting stopped for speeding and getting handcuffed on his way to the stadium. Last night, overtime, Detroit beat the Rams 26-20. 1 game left in Week 1. That's the Jets and 49ers tonight. At Wrigley, Cubs held the 4 hits, had only 7 hits in the 3-game series, but they scored twice in the first inning off Garrett Cole. Topped the Yankees 2-1, a game with no scoring after the top of the second. The Mets' 9-game winning streak ended. Cincinnati scored 2 in the ninth to win 3-1. U.S. Open final, Yannick Sinner showed why he's ranked number 1. Straight sets over Taylor Fritz. Still no American man has won a Grand Slam in 21 years. John Stashower, Bloomberg Sports, Karen Nathan.
Coast to coast on Bloomberg Radio, nationwide on Sirius XM, and around the world on Bloomberg.com and the Bloomberg Business app. This is Bloomberg Daybreak.
Good morning. I'm Nathan Hager. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen is reiterating her view that the U.S. economy has reached a soft landing. Her comments follow last week's stock sell-off and months of soft jobs data. In an interview with Bloomberg's David Gura at the Texas Tribune Festival in Austin, Yellen also underscored the importance of U.S. engagement with China. We now want to bring you part of their discussion.
What I see when I look at it, the economy, broadly speaking, is very strong growth, deep into a recovery with the economy operating at basically at full employment. We're still seeing 3% growth roughly over the last year, and it continues. Consumer spending, investment spending, solid. Inflation coming down substantially, and I believe headed back to the Fed's 2% goal. And what I describe as a strong, solid labor market. Clearly, the pace of job creation has gone down, and that's something we should expect. The unemployment rate has moved up somewhat off its very low level of, I think it got down to 3.4%. But it's not common in the United States to have unemployment rates in the 4s. And it's what I think of as a employment economy.
You say many people would call that a soft landing. So that is the Fed being able to get high inflation under control without triggering a deep downturn or recession.
That's right.
Many people would say that. Do you say that as well? Do you think that are you fairly confident that we're going to get that?
I think what we're seeing now is consistent with that. While there are risks, it really has been amazing to be able to get inflation down as meaningfully as we have. And I'd say also wages are going up at a decent clip, and real wages adjusted for inflation, are rising. And a lot of especially low-income households are under stress. Aspects of the cost of living for them are genuinely challenging, and it's our administration's top priority to try to address that. It's still true that wages have gone up since before the pandemic in real or inflation-adjusted terms, and continuing to rise at a decent pace.
What is your secret? As you think of embracing this role as a diplomat, what has made you particularly good or have the facility for?
Well, thank you for the compliment. I have seen this sort of diplomatic initiative, both with China and with other countries, as really critical, because we need to work together collaboratively to solve every global problem that we face, from climate change to Russia's aggression to issues that we have with China. And during the previous administration, I'm sorry to say, our alliances frayed, and it was America first, and that should really never be America alone. And it was necessary to rebuild alliances to work with allies around the world. And that's been a broad effort. And I think we really have succeeded. And perhaps we'll talk about this, but when Russia attacked Ukraine, we had an alliance that came together in a matter of a day or two to strongly counter what Russia was doing. We've stayed together, and we've worked together to address, and this is a broad effort, G20 or larger, to address climate change and problems afflicting poor countries around the world, to address pandemics. We created a pandemic fund knowing there'll probably be another pandemic, unfortunately, and we need to be better prepared than we were for COVID. So on many different fronts, we've tried to rebuild alliances. And with respect to China, relations had really deteriorated during the pandemic, and we went for a period of close to 2 years without any meaningful senior-level contact between U.S. and Chinese. And that was really a very dangerous state of affairs. President Biden met with President Xi in Bali. I was at that meeting, and they agreed that it was important to reestablish relationships.
And that was the Secretary of the U.S. Treasury, Janet Yellen, speaking with Bloomberg's David Gura. You can listen to their entire interview on the Bloomberg Talks podcast. Subscribe to hear all our high-profile conversations on Apple, Spotify, or anywhere else you get your podcasts. And David is here with us now for more on his conversation with the U.S. Treasury Secretary. David, good morning. Thanks for being here. Wide-ranging discussion, but a lot of focus on the Treasury Secretary saying that a soft landing has been achieved even with job growth slowing. How does she square that circle?
Yeah, she said in that bit of tape that you played, and we had our conversation a day after those jobs numbers came out, she feels very confident that we're getting back to a level that would be considered more normal in regular times. And all the while, we did talk about the trend that we've seen over the course of the year. So obviously, if you look at the 3-month average of what we've seen, it is dramatically lower in those non-farm payrolls than what we had at the beginning of this year. She acknowledges that. I asked her if there's any chance or if she sees any risk of us getting a negative print in those numbers by the end of the year, and she didn't bite at that question. But she's a labor economist by training, of course, Nathan. This is her bread and butter. And in a conversation that we had there on stage, and the day before when I accompanied her on a tour of a big IRS facility in Austin, right after those numbers came out, she continued to express confidence in the health or the strength of the labor market. So she acknowledges that there are those who are fearful that we're headed perhaps toward higher unemployment, but at this point feels confident that things are indeed going in the right direction.
You have to think that the Treasury Secretary was cognizant of the sell-off happening after those numbers came out, and perhaps trying to soothe the markets to some extent. Was there some of that involved, do you think?
She was projecting calm, and she speaks in a very matter-of-fact and careful way. You heard that in that tape as well. Another question that I asked her over the course of that hour-long conversation is, from her vantage, does she see pockets of risk elsewhere in the financial system? And she brought up money market funds, which she, under her stewardship of the of SOC, the kind of overarching financial regulation board, has worked to tackle. She talked about cybersecurity. So she said she saw no flashing red lights when she looks at the financial system broadly. But I think you're right, Nathan. I think she was actively trying to assure the markets there.
Now, although interesting to hear her say no flashing lights a day after we did see that big sell-off, the worst sell-off since the last time we saw flashing lights in the financial system around the time of the regional bank crisis.
We talked about that as well, and there were a couple of moments over the course of her tenure when she and her colleagues at Treasury, colleagues around the world, have had to get together and deal with crises. Certainly the war in Ukraine is one of them, but she did talk about that kind of compressed moment when we saw the collapse of First Republic, there was so much concern about contagion and they had to get together. So it was safe. I didn't introduce the subject of those failed banks. She did. It's safe to assume it still feels quite raw for her and is kind of a signal moment in her career. I mean, it was so wonderful to have so much time with her. I kind of offhandedly asked her if there's any chance that she remains in office after January 25th. If Kamala Harris were to be reelected, would she stay in the job? She didn't bat that away entirely, but made it seem like she probably would be done. But it was a moment to both look ahead to what she hopes to accomplish here in these next few months, presumably of her tenure, her final months of her tenure, but also back on some of those crisis moments, including what happened with those regional banks.
Yeah, I did want to ask you if it felt more like an exit interview to speak with Treasury Secretary Yellen at this point, or whether she is thinking about perhaps staying on a little bit longer. Is she running through the tape, or is this sort of the end for her?
She made it seem like she was. I mean, the interview was an hour, and we had 2 or 3 minutes left, and I said, you have this to-do list, what's on it? Give me a couple of things. And she gave quite a long answer of things that she hopes to accomplish, but it gave me more perspective on just the breadth of that job, what you have to do when you are the Treasury Secretary. And it's something that she expressed to me she's had to learn along the way. She is obviously incredibly accomplished and has had all of these marquee jobs. Of course, the Chief Economic Advisor to President Clinton, Federal Reserve Vice Chair and Chair, head of the San Francisco Federal Reserve Bank, and now the Treasury Secretary. All of these new and novel. She, a trained academic economist who has really embraced and found her way in each of these roles. She did not make it seem like that she'll be resting on her laurels in any sense here in the next few months.
Yeah, and certainly I know you're not going to be resting, heading right over to Philadelphia for tomorrow night's first debate, and perhaps only debate, between Vice President Harris and former President Trump. Does this conversation with Secretary Yellen inform what you're going to be thinking about as we head into this encounter tomorrow night?
You know, Janet Yellen, studiously avoids talking about politics, but did talk a lot about the Biden-Harris administration's economic priorities. And I'm very interested, Nathan, in hearing how much concrete policy comes up over the course of this debate. But as you point out, this is on the calendar the only time that these two candidates are supposed to meet face-to-face, and quite deliciously, they've never been in the same room together before. So there is the drama and theatrics of that, the two candidates facing each other on stage. But yes, I think that what I heard from Janet Yellen was a lot of pride and emphasis in the policies that they have been able to put in place since the COVID pandemic, and obviously a sense of urgency as well as she looks kind of unfinished business, mindful of what would happen to those initiatives if Vice President Harris loses this election and former President Trump were to win.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Today, your morning brief on the stories making news from Wall Street to Washington and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed at 6 a.m. Eastern each morning on Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning starting at 5 a.m. Wall Street time on Bloomberg 1130 in New York, Bloomberg 99.1 in Washington, Bloomberg 106.1 in Boston, and Bloomberg 960 in San Francisco.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Plus, listen coast to coast on the Bloomberg Business app, SiriusXM, the iHeartRadio app, and on Bloomberg.com. I'm Nathan Hager.
And I'm Karen Moscow. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day right here on Bloomberg Daybreak.